documented event in all of the Bible. I'm talking about the time of the Assyrian conquest, or attempted Assyrian conquest of Jerusalem. 3 different times in Scripture do we have this story retold. We see it in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19, in Chronicles chapter 32, in Isaiah chapter 36 and 37. With those 3 biblical accounts, we also have a couple of extra biblical accounts. There is a stone that is known as Sennacherib's prism. It's pictured up there on the side. It is the historical marker that was made by King Sennacherib, who was an Assyrian king, about his conquest, and it details his invasion of Israel and his attempted invasion of Jerusalem. It ends there. It doesn't tell us that he ended up conquering it, though, that this was a document, actually a propaganda piece, in order to show the world how powerful he was and his descendants how powerful their father was. We also have the historian Herodotus, who gives an account of the same event at the same time and place. In other words, this is an event that has been talked about by everyone. What is it? It's a day of crisis. It's the crisis that comes when a foreign army is coming in to take Jerusalem. When the Judean kingdom that had split off from Israel had gone into, would go into captivity. This is the moment that it happens, and they're bearing down on Jerusalem. Let's tell the story. It begins in 2 Kings chapter 18 and verses 1 through 12 with the king of Israel by the name of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was one of the great reformers of Judea. After the tribes had split, the 10 northern tribes never had a good king. The southern tribes would have a few good kings, and one of the best was Hezekiah. When Hezekiah comes into power, he begins to rebuild Israel to what it was, or to Judah, to what it was supposed to be. He goes in and he repairs the temple. He has cast out all the idols that were put in there. He restores the Passover, a celebration that hadn't been celebrated for generations. He was thorough. When people began bowing down and worshiping the serpent that Moses had created to save the Israelites, that item that had been yet for years, they had turned into an idol. He didn't care that it was this important historical piece. He said, it's causing problem, get rid of it. He begins to rebuild Israel, not just spiritually, but physically. But the problem was, he was a king in power in a moment of crisis. And when the Assyrians come calling, they take out the northern kingdom of Israel and take them away into captivity. And they have their eyes set on Judea. And Hezekiah begins to do everything he can in order to survive his kingdom. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and verses 22 and 25, it says, after the acts of the faithfulness of Sennacherib, king of Israel, came and invaded Judah and besieged the fortified cities, and thought to break in them for himself. Now when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, he intended to make war on Jerusalem. Hezekiah sees the threat coming, and he begins to prepare his people for it. He begins cutting off the water supplies and the water tunnels that surround the area. He doesn't want them to be able to come in and have easy water. But then he's got to get water for his city. So he builds a water tunnel. A tunnel that would bring water into the city. In fact, the water supply that would come in would be the pool of Siloam, which we read about in the New Testament. In the 1940s, when they were excavating this site, some boys found a tunnel that they crawled into, and when they did so, they found an inscription there giving credit to Hezekiah. It's what we read about later at the end of Hezekiah's reign in 2 Kings chapter 20 and verse 20. It talks about the projects that he did bringing water into Jerusalem. That's taking place during this time in order that he'll have a supply of water for his besieged city. But in doing so, he doesn't eliminate the crisis, because you don't get through a crisis by avoiding it. A crisis was coming. An army was on the brink. There was a problem coming. Sometimes when we face crisis, our initial instinct is to hide from it, to pretend it's not coming, to ignore it and hope it goes away. But that's not how you handle a crisis. Because no matter how much you try to ignore it, it's still coming. And eventually it does come for Judah. In Isaiah chapter 36 and verse 4 through 11, we see the events that occur that bring this crisis. The king Sennacherib sends one of his representatives, a man by the name of Rabshakeh. And he sends him to Hezekiah and says to his advisors, "What is this confidence that you have? Your counsel and strength for war are only empty words. Now on whom will you rely? You have rebelled against me. Behold, you rely on the staff of the crushed reed, even Egypt, and if a man leans on it, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh the king of Egypt for all who rely on him." When this advisor shows up, he begins to preach to the people of Judah. Hezekiah sends his ambassadors to meet him, and when he does, he says, "Where are you going to go? You're building up your fortifications. They're not going to hold. You don't have an ally that you can rely on." The biggest power in the day other than the Assyrians were the Egyptians. And he said, it's like leaning on a reed that's sharp. You know, anything you get from them, they're going to take out of you. It's going to hurt. They're going to hurt you just as bad as we are. In verse 7, he says, "But if you say, we will trust in the Lord, is it not he whose high places, whose the altars Hezekiah has taken away, and has said to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar?" Here he says, you're going to turn to God. Look at what you've done. You've taken down all the high places. You've removed all the Baal. That's exactly what Hezekiah had done. He had gone throughout the land and removed all the places of worship. Now here's the mistake, isn't it? Because Rabshakeh thinks that in doing so, they've displeased God. He says, you've become less religious. You've gotten rid of all your religion. But in fact, Hezekiah was drawing closer to God in doing that. You see, sometimes in the things that we do, others will look at it and think that we're doing the wrong thing. Rabshakeh continues on. He says in verse 10, "Now how can I come up without the Lord's approval against this land and destroy it?" He said, you're going to rely on God. God sent me. God sent me to punish you. And in fact, he was right. God had sent the Assyrians to punish Israel. It had been a long time coming. It had been prophesied. Remember earlier in 2 Chronicles, these acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib, the king of Israel, God was using him to punish Israel. And he just takes it a step farther and he says, if he didn't stop from doing it to them, what's he going to do to you? Of course, the king's advisors, they don't like hearing this message, and they definitely don't like the people hearing this message. So in verses 11 through 12, they say, or in verse 10, they say, "Now speak to us in Aramaic. Don't speak in Hebrew. That way the people won't understand what you're saying." You see, their attempt was, there's a crisis coming, and let's try to hide it. We may know it's coming, but we don't want anybody else to know it's coming. We don't want people to see the problem. We don't want to talk about the problem. Of course, Rabshakeh knows what he's doing because he keeps talking in Hebrew. And he turns to the people and he says, "Now, my master has sent not only me to speak these words, but not only to the men who sit on this wall, who are doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine." In other words, he turns to the people and says, you're the ones that are going to have to suffer when these guys make a mistake. When these guys don't bow down, when these guys don't make a deal, you're the ones who are going to suffer. And you can imagine what that did to the people of Israel. The people of Judah, I should say. Excuse me for that. People of Judah, they think it's over. They think, look, and they see this crisis coming. They see this army, and they don't see any hope. And he's right. Egypt's not going to protect them. They're facing punishment for what they've done. The leadership may be trying to hide this, but they know it's coming. What do? We turn over to 2 Kings 18 and verses 28 through 35, and we see how the Assyrians and their people tried to undermine Hezekiah. In verse 29, he says, "Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. he will not be able to deliver you from your hands. He goes to the people and says, this king that you support, he's not strong enough. He's not good enough. He can't handle this. In verse 31, he says, make your peace with me and come out to me and eat each from his vineyard and each from his fig tree and drink the water from his own cistern. In other words, he says, if you give up, your life won't be any different. You'll get what you'll have a good life. You'll have your own fig tree. You'll have your own cistern. It'll be easy. Don't fight against me. Join me. Give up. And it'll be easy. In verse 35, he says, who among the gods of the land has delivered their land from my hand, that God should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? What does he tell the people? You're not strong enough. You won't be able to make it. Look at the evidence. Everybody else has fallen. Why not you? See, many times when we face crisis, we face similar threats. Similar threats that tell us we're not good enough, we're not strong enough to handle this. That it would just be easier if we gave up. Things won't change that much. Life will continue to go on. We can just give up and go back to the easier thing. Besides, who's going to deliver us? Who's going to make it right? But you don't get through a crisis by giving up. So what does Hezekiah do? If you would open up your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 19 and verses 1 through 19. Here Hezekiah is a leader in the midst of crisis. His own people have been scared to death. An army is on the brink and everything looks like it's about to fall. All the good work that he has done is about to go for naught. What does he do? Well, in verses 1 through 7, we see that he listens to a godly person. He sends word with his messengers to go to Isaiah the prophet. Remember, this story is told three different ways in the history of Kings and Chronicles, but also through the prophet Isaiah. And by going to Isaiah, he is going to the man of God. And he listens to what that man has to say. And he tells him, don't you worry. I know it looks bad. I know it looks difficult, but God will deliver. And so in the next section, in verses 8 through 13, he begins to do just that. He dismisses all the naysayers. He dismisses all those who are ready to give up. He dismisses those who want to ignore or try something else. He doesn't deal with that. He doesn't listen to these critics. He doesn't listen to the people who can only find fault. And in 2 Kings chapter 19 and verse 14, he turns to God. It says, and Hezekiah took the letter from his hand of the messengers and read it, and he went up to the house of the Lord, and he spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O God, the God of Israel, you are enthroned above the cherubim. You are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Listen to the words of Sennacherib. He has been a reproach to the living God. Truly, O God, the kings of Assyria have devastated nations in their lands, and they have cast their gods into the fire, but they were not gods. They were the work of men, of hands and wood and stone, so they have destroyed them. Now, O Lord our God, I pray, deliver us from his hand. All the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord, O God. What's Hezekiah do? He does what you have to do in a crisis because you can't ignore it. You can't give up, but you can go to God. The way you get through a crisis is by relying on God. Hezekiah wasn't strong enough to beat this army. Hezekiah wasn't good enough to deserve salvation. Hezekiah wasn't going to be able to rally his people, but he knew that God could. And he trusted in what the prophet told him, that this was not the end. And though it seemed bleak, and though it seemed like this army was undefeatable, he had said no. In fact, he's going to end up packing up camp and running back home. Something's going to happen to him that's going to cause him to quit. Remember I said that this event is recorded outside of the Bible? In fact, the prism of Sennacherib that tells all about the conquest of Israel and goes into full detail about all they did. When it comes to Judah, it just basically says he besieged Jerusalem, and then there's a period. And anyone of a historian who reads that goes, that's really odd. Because normally if he besieges a place, he took it. But for some reason, he never mentions what happens afterwards. And we know from the historical record that it wouldn't be long before he would die in his own land from a coup from his own people, his own sons. What happened? Herodias says that there was mice that came into the supplies of the Assyrians and it forced them to retreat. Somehow they got infested, and before they could lay siege, they had to return back to their homeland because their supply lines were cut. The Bible just tells us that the angel of the Lord did something. And they gave up and turned and went away. Sometimes in history, there's battles that are fought. And there's one side that's destined to win. But for some strange reason, it just doesn't happen. This is one of those episodes. But we know the story. We know what really happened. Because it doesn't matter how big of an army you have. It doesn't matter how powerful you may seem. You cannot stand against God's will. But you can rely on it. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verses 6 through 7, it says, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. Cast your anxiety on him, because he cares for you." Here Peter is telling us to humble ourselves. God is opposed to the proud. When we think and we face a crisis and we think that we're going to get ourselves through it, when we come to that point, what we usually find ourselves is humbled. Maybe we can get through some things. Maybe we can rely on our friends and family, but there's going to be that time, there's going to be that event, there's going to be that crisis that comes that's just too big. And that's when we need to humble ourselves and give it to God. Cast your worry, cast your anxiety, cast your troubles on him. Why? Because he cares for you. He listened to Hezekiah, and he will listen to us today. If we go before him, if we throw it all out in front of him, we lay it in front of him and say, "God, here's my problems, here's my worry, here's my trouble," we can trust that God cares for us. In Philippians chapter 4 and verses 6 through 7, we read, "Be anxious for nothing, but by in everything prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Be anxious for nothing. Why? Because you have prayer. Because you have a God that listens to you. And if we can turn it over to him, we can find a peace that goes beyond what we can understand. The peace of God which surpasses all comprehension. You know, logically, everything the Assyrians said was true. Everything they thought was right. They had the bigger army. They had the more powerful people. Judah didn't have any allies. They didn't have any chance. Because Hezekiah was willing to turn to God. Because he had followed him. Because he had listened to him. Because he obeyed him. He knew that God would be there for him. You know, sometimes when we face a crisis, we think it's the worst thing that could possibly happen to us. But it's not. Sometimes a crisis is exactly what we need. Because it's not until the crisis comes that we're willing to change. That we're willing to bear down. That we're willing to give up. Not give up to the crisis, but give up ourselves to God. Because we stubbornly refuse to submit. We're so sure of ourselves, we're so confident in our own achievements that we forget that But there are some times that are just things bigger than us, things that cause us to rely on God. James would say in James chapter 1 and verses 2 and 4, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let that endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Here he tells us, consider it joy. What? Consider it joy when you face trials? Consider it a good thing when everything's bad? Why? Because in doing so, you gain endurance. Until you have a reason to give up, you probably won't take the chance to give up. But when we face the crisis, we see where our faith really is. We see how much we truly need God. It's not until that moment that our eyes are open to our situation, because we fool ourselves. We ignore it. We think it'll go away, right? We think we can handle it. But it's in those moments of trial that we truly know we need God. And in doing so, it makes us closer to God. It perfects us. It makes us complete. Later on in James chapter 1 and verse 12, it says, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him." Why are crises not always the worst thing we face? Because when we come through on the other side, we come somewhere better. Hezekiah would come through this crisis. He would come through this crisis because he relied on God. And from that point forward, Hezekiah knows something. He truly knows something, that God will be with him. I mean, think about the things Hezekiah was doing, how they were received. Even the foreign king, what did he say? He said, "You've turned from God. Look at all the terrible things you're doing, tearing down these altars." I'm sure the people were very upset when he took this ancient relic of Moses and he threw it in the trash and said, "We can't have this anymore because it's leading us in the wrong direction." I'm sure for the people it was a shocking change of things when he said, "We're going back to what God has said. I know we've been doing something different for generations, but there's a time for a change. There's a time to fix things." Hezekiah may have even doubted himself. But there were no doubts of what God would do. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. Because once he has shown himself approved, he'll receive that crown of life. So where do you go in the moment of crisis? Where do you go when everything seems to be falling apart? Where do you go when you don't know what else to do? You go to God. You go to God because he is there for you, because he cares for you. You go to God because he has a way to deliver you. It may not be easy. It may require great faith. It may require you to change the things that you've been doing and the way that you've been living. It may require you to start all over again. But he will see you through. And if you gain that endurance and you gain that strength and you don't give up, in the end you'll find yourself in a far, far better place. I don't know what crisis you may be facing today. Maybe it's a crisis of confidence. You're not sure about your future. Maybe it's a crisis of faith. Maybe something has been testing your faith. Maybe it's a crisis of temptation. Maybe there's something in your life that's pulling you away. It's that voice of the foreigner telling you you can't make it, you give up, it's not worth it. It'll be so much easier if you just let go and give in. There's a solution to any crisis that you face, and it's turning to God. Today, maybe you need to give yourself over to your Lord. Maybe today you need to fall before him and say, "I'll do whatever you need me to do." Maybe today you need to obey the plan of salvation. Maybe as a Christian you need to go to your Heavenly Father in prayer to strengthen you and to encourage you. You don't have to do it alone. There's a family of people here to support you. There are people that will encourage you. There are people that will lift you up and get you through whatever you're facing. I don't know what your crisis is, but I know the solution is to turn to God. And if you need to do so today, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.